Welcome to the exhibit titled Iowa and the Civil War, Nothing But Victory. At the entrance on the left, there is a large image of the Iowa monument at the Vicksburg National Cemetery. The image is courtesy of Vicksburg National Military Park. As you enter, an introduction to the exhibit reads, "From 1861 to 1865, more than 600,000 Americans perished during the Civil War, more than the combined total of all wars from the American Revolution through the Vietnam conflict. Iowans participated intensely in this bloody experience. How did this happen? As the United States expanded during the 1800s, its northern and southern cultures grew increasingly polarized. The North featured a mix of new immigrants, growing towns and cities with expanded manufacturing, and family farms. In contrast, Southerners relied on slavery to power a lucrative cotton-based economy. Political compromises over slavery and related economic issues kept tensions in check until the 1850s, when a string of events tied to the issue of whether to allow slavery in new American territories ruptured the spirit of unity. America's differences divided church denominations, political parties, and even families. After 11 Southern states decided to form their own nation in 1860 and 1861, fighting erupted. Initially, Northerners fought to hold the country together, viewing secession as a treasonous act. Eventually, President Lincoln expanded the war's aim to include ending slavery. The panel, titled Iowa in 1860, reads, "By the time Abraham Lincoln became president in 1861, Iowa's frontier period had passed and most of the state was settled. Since 1850, the population had increased almost fourfold to almost 675,000 people. By 1861, railroads had crossed the Mississippi River and were well on their way to reaching towns on the Missouri River along Iowa's western border. These lines tied Iowa to profitable eastern markets and travelers, and goods could reach the eastern seaboard in 3 days by train. Before that, a trip could take well over a month. Between 1830 and 1861, settlers of many cultures intermixed throughout the state, forming a dynamic population. English, Irish, and Germans dominated the pre-Civil War population in Iowa, but Holland, Bohemia, and Scandinavia also contributed. A small number of African Americans from border states also settled in Iowa. Growing agricultural production contributed to the growth and development of Iowa's first cities and towns, such as Davenport, Dubuque, Muscatine, and Keokuk. To the right of the exhibit introduction is an interactive touchscreen which has the timeline of Civil War events. This section will cover the years of 1820 to 1859. 1820 Missouri Compromise. This agreement attempts to ease political tensions between free and slave-holding states by guaranteeing equal representation in the U.S. Senate. The image is a map of the U.S. in 1820 showing the Missouri Compromise. 1839, Iowa Supreme Court decides case of Ralph. Advertisement for the return of a freedom seeker who escaped Missouri for freedom in the Iowa Territory. The image is of Keokuk Argus advertisement for the return of a freedom seeker who escaped Missouri for freedom in the Iowa Territory. 1845 to 1846, Florida and Iowa statehood. Iowa joins the Union as a free state. Florida enters as a slave state, keeping the political balance identified in the Missouri Compromise. The image is a map of the United States in 1850, which shows the addition of Iowa and Florida in the Union. 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel dramatizing the evils of slavery stirs abolitionist sentiments and frightens Southern enslavers. The image is from State Historical Society of Iowa. 1854, Kansas-Nebraska Act. Creation of these new territories voids the Missouri Compromise by allowing each state to determine whether to permit slavery, sparking bloodshed between settlers. The image is Kansas Free Soil Convention at Fort Scott, Kansas, 1850s, from Northwind Archives. 1857, Spirit Lake Conflict. In 1857, amidst rising tensions between Native Americans and new settlers, Santee Sioux warriors raid settlements in northwestern Iowa and murder about 40 people. Image caption, Sioux warriors seize young Abby Gardner from the State Historical Society of Iowa. 1857 Dred Scott decision. The Supreme Court rules that Congress cannot restrict slavery in U.S. territories. The court defines enslaved people as property and not citizens, even if they become free. Image caption, Dred Scott was defined as property and lost his appeal for freedom from the Library of Congress. 1857 Underground Railroad. Mid to late 1850s, Underground Railroad activity in Iowa increases. Iowans shelter and help freedom seekers escape to Canada. Image 1 is of Reverend John Todd, the key agent of the Underground Railroad in Tabor, Iowa. Painting is from the collection of the State Historical Society of Iowa. Image number 2, radical abolitionist John Brown moves through Iowa and plans a raid at the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Painting is from the collection of the State Historical Society of Iowa. And the third image is from the State Historical Society of Iowa. 1859 Harper's Ferry Raid. Abolitionist John Brown leads a failed attempt to raid a Virginia arsenal, arm enslaved people, and help them rebel against their enslavers. Southerners fear further attempts to abolish slavery. Image caption, Harper's Ferry, the fighting at the engine house. Federal troops attack John Brown and his fellow insurgents at Harper's Ferry. The image is from the Library of Congress. To the right of the exhibit introduction is an interactive touchscreen which has a timeline of Civil War events. This section will cover the years of 1860 to 1862. 1860, Abraham Lincoln elected president. Lincoln's opposition to extending slavery to new states frightens pro-slavery Southerners. Shortly after the election, South Carolina becomes the first state to secede from the Union. Image caption, Abraham Lincoln, from the Library of Congress. 1861, 11 Southern states leave the Union. These states form the Confederate States of America, a new country. Lincoln's reunification efforts fail as tensions escalate. Image caption, Map of the United States in 1861 from the Library of Congress. 1861, Fort Sumter surrenders to Confederate forces. After the Charleston, South Carolina garrison falls, Lincoln calls for volunteers to fight against the rebellion. Iowans join enthusiastically and begin forming regiments. Image 1 caption, Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter in Charleston, April 1861. Image 2, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, from the Library of Congress. 1861, Battle of Bull Run. Confederate forces win the war's first large battle in Virginia. Image caption, Battle of Bull Run, from the Library of Congress. 1861, Battle of Wilson's Creek. This is the first combat experience for many Iowans. The Confederates win this first battle over control of Missouri. Image caption, Charge of the 1st Iowa Infantry at Wilson's Creek, from the Library of Congress. 1861, Battle of Belmont, Missouri. With a number of Iowa regiments under his command, General Ulysses S. Grant leads his first fight. Image caption, Battle of Belmont, Library of Congress. 1862, authorities arrest publisher Dennis Mahoney. The founder of the Dubuque Herald strongly criticizes President Lincoln and opposes the Civil War. Republicans call him and his cohorts Copperheads and regard them as traitors. Image caption, Center for Dubuque History. 1862, Home and Battlefield. Annie Wittenmeyer of Keokuk visits war wounded and discovers that the Army is ill prepared to handle large numbers of battlefield casualties. She leads a national movement to establish dietary kitchens designed to promote healing. Image caption, Annie Wittenmeyer, State Historical Society of Iowa. 1862, Sioux Uprising in southwest Minnesota. Iowa forms the Northern Border Brigade to protect settlers in northwestern Iowa. 1862, Battle of Antietam. The bloodiest battle of the war ends in a Union victory. Confederate General Robert E. Lee's invasion of Maryland stopped. Image caption, Battle of Antietam, Library of Congress. 1862, President Lincoln issues Emancipation Proclamation. Enslaved people in Confederate states are declared free. Lincoln's move shifts the war's aim from the preservation of the Union to ending slavery. Image caption, Formerly enslaved people reach Union lines after the Emancipation Proclamation, from the North Wind Picture Archives. 1862, Keokuk National Cemetery established. The government established this cemetery to bury veterans who died in the area's 5 hospitals. Over 600 soldiers were buried there by the end of the war. To the right of the exhibit introduction is an interactive touchscreen which has a timeline of Civil War events. This section will cover the years of 1863 to 1864. 1863, Vicksburg, Mississippi surrenders. Union forces now control the entire Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in 2. Also, Iowa crops can again be shipped downriver. Image caption: Union troops storm Confederate fortification at Vicksburg. The image is from the Army Center of Military History. 1863, Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This major Union victory turns back General Lee's northern invasion. Image caption: Battle of Gettysburg. 1863, the first Iowa Volunteers of African descent forms in Muscatine. For the first time in American history, black troops officially become part of the U.S. Army. The 1st Iowa is later renamed the 60th United States Colored Infantry. They serve in Missouri and Arkansas. Image caption: Regimental flag of the 60th U.S. Colored Infantry, State Historical Society of Iowa. 1863, military prison opens on Rock Island, Illinois. 12,000 Confederate prisoners stayed here during the war. Image caption: Rock Island Prison, from the Rock Island Arsenal Museum. 1863, Battle of Chattanooga. Union forces, including thousands of Iowa troops, capture this strategic Tennessee city, opening the way for the invasion of Georgia in the Deep South. Image caption: Battle above the clouds on Lookout Mountain in Chattanooga. Artist unknown. Photographed by the North Wind Picture Archives. 1864, Atlanta falls to Union. General William T. Sherman's army, with many Iowa regiments, occupies Georgia's most important city, and his army prepares to launch its famous March to the Sea. Image caption: Confederates fighting to hold the heights in the Battle of Resaca, Georgia. Photographed by Northwind Picture Archives. 1864, Sherman's army captures Savannah, Georgia. Union forces complete their march to the sea. With control of most key points in the Deep South complete, Sherman heads towards Virginia to help Grant defeat Lee. Image caption: Sherman's March to the Sea, a song written by Iowan Samuel Byers, from the Library of Congress. To the right of the exhibit introduction is an interactive touchscreen which has a timeline of Civil War events. This section will cover the years of 1865 to 1868. 1865, 13th Amendment to the Constitution passes. Millions of enslaved people are freed. 1865, Sherman captures Columbia, the capital of South Carolina. Image caption: Iowa soldiers seize the state flag off the Capitol building. The image is from the State Historical Society of Iowa. 1865, Union forces occupy Richmond, Virginia. Confederate capital falls to Grant's army. Confederate President Jefferson Davis flees and is later captured. 1865, Lee surrenders to Grant. The main Confederate army lays down arms at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Most major hostilities are now over. Armed resistance is largely over by the summer. 1865, Lincoln assassinated. Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth shoots the president at the Ford Theater in Washington and shocks the nation. Image caption: Lincoln lies on his deathbed across the street from the theater. Image from the Library of Congress. 1868, 14th Amendment added to the U.S. Constitution. Image caption: Black male citizens conferred full rights as citizens. Image from the Library of Congress. Expanding material life, manufacturing, and agriculture. While commercial products were available to those who could afford them in Iowa's territorial days, the price of most goods reflected the high cost of transportation from eastern cities or Europe. By the 1850s, improved technology in agriculture, industrialization, and transportation elevated many families' standard of living and made manufactured goods more widely available. Prosperous Iowa families increasingly demonstrated their social status by what they owned. Artifacts on display include small boxes from the 18th and 19th centuries. This group of boxes reflects the cultural diversity of early Iowa. Each was brought to Iowa by early immigrants. Another artifact is medallion pattern silver tea and coffee service, circa 1860. George L. Davenport, son of George Davenport, founder of the city of Davenport, was able to more easily acquire this Greek-themed silver tea and coffee set because of the increased ease of railroad transportation from East Coast factories prior to the Civil War. Manufacturing. In the 1850s, Iowa began to develop a manufacturing base. Manufacturing was primarily related to exploiting natural resources. Dubuque was well known for its lead mining, and Davenport developed lumber and woodworking industries. Smaller industries emerged in the interior towns, such as Fairfield, where entrepreneur Daniel Stevenson was producing woven coverlets from the mid-1850s through the 1870s. Other typical pre-war industries were local potteries, such as Martin White in Cedar Falls, the Melcher brothers in Parrish, and David Roberts in Colesburg. Artifacts on display include a 2-gallon stoneware jar. Dennis Melcher and his brother Edward emigrated from Germany to Iowa in the 1840s. First settling in Burlington, they later moved to rural Henry County, Iowa in the mid-1850s. There, they established potteries that continued to supply wares to southeastern Iowa for the rest of the 19th century. This jar was produced by David Melcher between 1855 and 1865. Another artifact on display is an earthenware bowl from 1860 to 1870. Several small Iowa communities served as locations for local potters. David Roberts settled in Colesburg in 1857 and started a pottery. In 1863, he sold it to Elisha Jones, who operated it until 1870. This bowl, made in the Colesburg pottery, was used by Augustus H. Mallory of Clayton County to collect maple sap to make maple syrup. Another artifact on display is a 4-gallon stoneware jar. In 1860, Martin White moved from New York to Cedar Falls to start a pottery. By 1870, he had moved on to Fort Dodge, Iowa, and had established what would become Iowa's largest pottery, the Fort Dodge Stoneware Company. This jar, made between 1860 and 1865, is representative of White's Cedar Falls wares. Another artifact on display is a silver trophy goblet from 1857. The Iowa State Agricultural Society was founded in 1853 at Fairfield, Iowa. Its mission was to promote agricultural research and to disseminate agricultural information. By 1858, it had succeeded in convincing the state legislature to authorize and appropriate funds for Iowa Agricultural College, now Iowa State University. This trophy was presented by the Iowa State Agricultural Society for Best Roadster Filly. Another artifact on display hanging from the wall is 1857 coverlet. Daniel Stevenson immigrated to America from England in 1840. Settling first in New York, then Ohio, he made his way to Iowa in 1849. Living in Fairfield, he continued weaving coverlets like this one shown here until his death from cancer in 1874. Stevenson's operation in Fairfield was typical of pre-Civil War manufacturing in Iowa. Agriculture. Iowa's agricultural output grew significantly in the 1850s. Rich land and agricultural innovations contributed to this expansion, and the groundwork was being laid for an even greater post-war production of Iowa farm products. While war production was dominated by wheat production, Iowa was second in the nation in wheat production during the Civil War, many Iowa farmers followed the dictum to, quote, raise corn always in preference to wheat, learn to convert corn into pork, beef, and wool by the most economical modes, end quote. Image caption, Iowans commonly used planters such as this Moline corn planter. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. An artifact on display is the Keystone corn planter from 1860 to 1870, made by Galt and Tracy, Rock Falls, Illinois. In the 1850s and 1860s, Iowa farmers had a reputation for readily accepting new technology. It was said that the Iowa farmer was noted for, quote, getting his operation on wheels as quickly as possible and with a seat, if possible." End quote. Galt and Tracy called their first corn planters the Keystone. Later in 1870, when they reorganized, the firm became the Keystone Manufacturing Company. Civil War battles, Wilson's Creek. Struggling to control the Missouri. The people of the slave state of Missouri fought and argued passionately over the question of whether to remain in the Union or join the Confederacy. Both sides understood the strategic importance of controlling this battleground state in the Upper South. People living along Iowa's southern border feared an invasion from Missouri. These residents were concerned about roving, pro-slavery guerrilla bands in northern Missouri that would sweep into a community, usually at night, attack, and then disappear into the darkness. The two most important battles for Missouri were Wilson's Creek, which slowed a Confederate advance, and Pea Ridge, Arkansas, that stopped any serious rebel resistance in the Show Me state. Image 1 caption: as this print shows, Iowans fought in the Battle of Prairie Grove, another engagement that helped keep Missouri and northern Arkansas in Union hands. The image is from Iowa in War Times by Samuel Byers. A quote reads, "Missouri was neither north nor south. She was simply hell, for her people were cutting one another's throat, and neighboring farmers killed each other and burned each other's homes. Brothers of the same family were in opposing armies." End quote. Written by Samuel Byers. An artifact on display is a sword. After the war broke out, Reverend James McKean, Dean of Lenox College in Hopkinton, Iowa, volunteered for service along with all but 4 of his students, causing the school to close temporarily. McKean served as captain of the unit made up of his students. He died of disease while stationed in Memphis, Tennessee. This was his sword. An image on the wall reads, "Shelby Norman of Muscatine died at Wilson's Creek, the first Iowan killed in battle. He served with Company A, 1st Iowa Infantry. Parts of his unit fell victim to friendly fire because the Iowa troops wore gray uniforms, and fellow Union troops mistook them for rebels." Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Battle of Wilson's Creek, August 10th, 1861. Fought south of Springfield, the first major battle in the West included the 1st Iowa Infantry Regiment. Outnumbered Union troops, commanded by Nathaniel Lyon, who was killed in the battle, initiated the fight before the Union troops' 90-day enlistment period expired. Militarily, the Confederates prevailed, but did not drive the Union forces completely away. The rebels, unable to capitalize on their military victory, stayed in the southern part of the state, while the rest of Missouri remained under Union control. One artifact on display is a print, Battle of Wilson's Creek by Kurtz and Allison, 1893. Kurtz and Allison's 1893 chromolithograph rendering of the Battle of Wilson's Creek depicts the moment when a rebel bullet struck General Lyon and killed him. Note the Iowa 1st Infantry battle flag on the left. The image is from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Another artifact on display is Harper's Ferry musket, 1828. During the Battle of Wilson's Creek, a bullet struck the barrel in front of Charles Hayes, 1st Iowa Volunteer Infantry. The bullet shattered as it struck this Harper's Ferry musket and wounded Hayes, a Marshalltown resident. On the wall is a portrait of Nathaniel Lyon. Some historians believe that Nathaniel Lyon, shown in this portrait, saved Missouri for the Union even though his force technically lost the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Civil War battles, Pea Ridge. Battle of Pea Ridge, Arkansas, March 7 through 8, 1862. Outnumbered Union forces, including 5 Iowa units, prevailed in this 2-day battle in northern Arkansas. As a result, the Union controlled Missouri and threatened Arkansas. General Samuel Curtis, a former Iowa congressman and Keokuk mayor, led the Union's forces. His victory gave the Union undisputed control in Missouri. Grenville Dodge of Council Bluffs, William Vandiver of Dubuque, and Cyrus Bussey of Bloomfield held command positions, fought with distinction, and later became generals. The Union Army suffered 1,384 casualties, including 203 killed. Of that total, 379 Iowans suffered wounds and 64 died. Even though Missouri had been secured as the result of the Battle of Pea Ridge, guerrilla bands still sporadically bushwhacked throughout the state during the war. Among these gangs were Jesse and Frank James, who became infamous outlaws after the war. An image reads, "Rebel forces, including a regiment of Cherokee Indians, strike Union forces at Pea Ridge. The Union repulsed this charge and won the battle." The image is from the Library of Congress. A quote from Samuel Byers reads, "The first dead men I saw while in the Army were 8 Missouri farmers, murdered by guerrillas and left lying in the hot sun and dust at the roadside. How I pitied the women and children who lived in the state in those awful days." Samuel Ryan Curtis, 1805 to 1866. Before the Civil War began, Samuel Curtis had graduated from the U.S. Military Academy, fought in the Mexican War, served as mayor of Keokuk, and represented Iowa in Congress. When the war began, Curtis was made a general in command of an army in Missouri. In March 1862, his troops won the key Battle of Pea Ridge. General Curtis served in the Western Theater for the rest of the war. He returned to Iowa after the Civil War to promote railroad development and died in Council Bluffs in 1866. The image caption reads, "General Samuel Curtis of Keokuk," from the book Iowa Colonels and Regiments by A. Stewart, 1865. Artifacts on display include Model 1847 Grimsley saddle. General Curtis used this privately purchased Grimsley saddle throughout the Civil War. The saddle is based on an 1847 Model Dragoon saddle issued to soldiers during the Mexican-American War. It was a popular saddle and continued in use during the Civil War. Also on display is Model 1840 Light Artillery sword. General Curtis favored this privately purchased sword, which was retailed by the Horstman Company in Philadelphia. The blade is marked Soligen. Civil War battles, Belmont. The Army of Tennessee takes shape. Most Iowans fought with this army, named after the Tennessee River. They fought primarily in the western part of the United States, now known as the Mississippi Valley. Initially led by General Ulysses S. Grant, the Army of the Tennessee was among the most successful armies in the war. It repeatedly struck winning blows against Confederate forces, penetrating deep into the South and contributing decisively to the defeat of the Confederacy. First Blood, the Battle of Belmont. 2 Iowa regiments under General Grant's command fought at the Battle of Belmont on November 7, 1861. Grant's army moved to challenge rebel troops stationed at Columbus, Kentucky. The armies met at nearby Belmont, Missouri. Although the battle ended inconclusively, it did help hold the slave state of Kentucky in the Union. Following the battle, Grant occupied Paducah, Kentucky, and then proceeded to challenge 2 key rebel installations, Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee. Image 1 caption. Readers of the popular Harper's Weekly viewed these drawings of one of the first battles in the Western Theater, the Battle of Belmont. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Quote from Rebecca Wentz, wife of Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Wentz, 7th Iowa Infantry, who was killed at Belmont. Quote, "She came upon his body where his men, at his order, had left him. Mrs. Wentz let out a low, agonizing cry and dropped down to prostrate upon his body." End quote. Subduing the South, Union Strategy. This section has a slideshow outlining the Union strategy to defeat the Confederate Army. After the slave states secede from the Union, General-in-Chief Winfield Scott proposes a military strategy to crush the rebellion and reunite the country. The strategy's success relies on 2 key tactics. First, blockade all southern and eastern ports, and second, control the Mississippi River from Illinois to the Gulf of Mexico. The strategy became known as Scott's Great Snake, or the Anaconda Plan, since it squeezes the Confederacy like a giant snake killing its prey. Lincoln rejects the overall plan as being too passive and taking too long. However, he blockades all eastern and southern ports in April 1861. Union forces battle for control of the Mississippi River. By August 1862, Union control extends southward as far as heavily fortified Vicksburg, Mississippi, and northward as far as Port Hudson, Louisiana. Following the Union's 6-week siege of Vicksburg, the Confederacy surrenders. The Mississippi River is under Union control to the Gulf of Mexico, and the South is divided. Following victories in Tennessee, the Union battles to further divide the South as General Sherman advances toward Atlanta. Sherman's forces advance toward the sea, destroying factories, farms, and railroads along the way and living off the land. The South is divided again when Union forces reach Savannah. From Savannah, Sherman's forces continue to battle northward through South Carolina, then North Carolina. In Virginia, General Grant's 9-month siege of Petersburg ends. Union forces pursue General Lee's remaining troops, forcing surrender at Appomattox Courthouse to end the war. Although Lincoln initially rejects the Anaconda Plan, its overall strategy provides the basis for Union victory. Civil War battles, Forts Henry and Donelson, February 1862. General Grant's Union forces captured these two forts, located only 12 miles apart and situated on two strategic rivers, the Tennessee and the Cumberland. These important Union victories opened a route to enter the Confederacy via Tennessee. Shortly after, Union forces occupied their first Confederate state capital, Nashville. They were the biggest victories for the Union up to that point of the war. General Grant skillfully led a combined land and water assault on the forts. The 2nd Iowa Infantry led the attack that forced the surrender of Fort Donelson. Controlling the rivers allowed Union troops to move more freely. As an invading and occupying army, they had to fight a long-distance war and needed the rivers to transport troops and supplies. Image caption: General Ulysses S. Grant, who lived in Galena, Illinois, across the river from Dubuque, Iowa, commanded thousands of Iowa troops when he headed the Army of Tennessee. He later became overall commander of the Union Army, leading forces in Virginia that finally defeated the Confederacy's best general, Robert E. Lee. Historians regard Grant as the Civil War's most innovative and effective leader. Image from the National Archives. In the display case below the panel about Forts Henry and Donelson is information about James M. Tuttle, who lived from 1823 to 1892. James Tuttle settled in Van Buren County in 1844, where he began a business and farming career and served as sheriff. He raised a company shortly after the war started and was elected captain over his men. This unit became part of the 2nd Iowa Infantry Regiment. Tuttle distinguished himself as an aggressive, capable leader at the Battle of Fort Donelson, where he was wounded but continued fighting. At the Battle of Shiloh, Tuttle courageously held his ground at the bloody Hornet's Nest. Tuttle also fought at Vicksburg and rose to the rank of general. In 1863, he returned to Iowa and ran unsuccessfully for governor. Tuttle eventually moved to Des Moines, entered the business world, and served as the state commander of the Grand Army of the Republic. Image caption: General James Tuttle of Farmington. From the book Iowa Colonels and Regiment by A. Stewart, 1865. There are several artifacts on display, including officer's shoulder decoration, a single-shot pistol. It is believed that General Tuttle found this pistol on the Shiloh battlefield. Model 1860-foot officer's sword. This German-made sword, retailed by Schuler, Hartley, and Graham of New York City, was used by General Tuttle throughout the war. Adams Kara .36 caliber revolver. This unusual revolver, belonging to General Tuttle, was patented in England but produced by the Massachusetts Army Company of Chicopee Falls, Massachusetts. The company produced about 600 of these revolvers. This diorama shows the 2nd Iowa Infantry's courageous assault on Fort Donelson. The figure holding the flag represents Voltaire Twombly, one of Iowa's first Medal of Honor heroes. His heroism while carrying the 2nd Iowa Infantry's battle flag earned him this high distinction. The diorama was built by Michael Carr of Carson, Iowa, and Don Berry of Des Moines, Iowa. Image 1 caption: Voltaire Twombly, Iowa in War Times by Samuel Byers. Image 2 caption: The Battle of Fort Donelson, Charge of the 2nd Iowa. The 2nd Iowa Infantry's valiant charge up the walls of Fort Donelson helped Union forces earn an important victory. Iowa in War Times by Samuel Byers. Image 3 caption: Battle of Fort Donelson, 1887 print shows Union forces charging Fort Donelson, Library of Congress. Civil War battles, Shiloh, seeing the elephant for the first time. The Battle of Shiloh, fought April 6th and 7th, 1862, represented by far the biggest battle of the war up to that time, shocking the nation with enormous numbers of casualties. 8 of 10 soldiers who fought there experienced combat for the first time. The expression for combat was, quote, seeing the elephant, end quote. Shiloh, also known as Pittsburgh Landing, dispelled any illusions about a limited war. Iowa's regiments in the Army of the Tennessee were now battle-hardened troops. 11 Iowa regiments fought at Shiloh and played a big part in the battle. In fact, 1 in 4 Union deaths were Iowans. With a total of 24,000 killed or wounded, the total casualties from this battle alone exceeded those from all of America's previous wars combined: the American Revolution, War of 1812, and the Mexican War. Free to navigate the Tennessee River, Grant pushed his forces south from Fort Henry towards Corinth, Mississippi, an important railroad junction for the Confederacy. Shortly after his troops left their ships and camped near Shiloh Church at Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee, Confederates unleashed an aggressive surprise attack and almost defeated the Union Army on April 6. After that devastating first day, Grant responded to a question about withdrawing. Quote, retreat? No. I propose to attack at daylight and whip them. End quote. This he did with reinforcements, as Union forces launched a surprise attack and won the field. The Confederates withdrew to Corinth. Image caption, Armies Clash at Shiloh, from the Library of Congress. Quote, up to the Battle of Shiloh, I believed that the rebellion would collapse suddenly and soon if a decisive victory could be gained over any of its armies. After Shiloh, I gave up all idea of saving the Union except by complete conquest. I saw an open field so covered with dead that it would have been possible to walk across the clearing, in any direction stepping on dead bodies, without a foot touching the ground. End quote. General Ulysses S. Grant. There are several artifacts on display. First is a map of Union forces at Shiloh. Grenville Dodge drew this map showing the position of major Union forces at Shiloh. The map is from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Also on display, Shiloh Bible. On the second day of the battle, Henry Clinton Parkhurst found this Bible in the hands of a dead Confederate soldier who was propped up against a tree. The Bible was open to the 8th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel. There is some mystery attending the Bible, for it contains the name and regiment of an Illinois resident. Perhaps the Confederate soldier picked it up from a Union camp overrun in the first day's fighting. Also on display, Springfield rifle musket. This bent and broken rifle musket from the Battle of Shiloh attests to the fury and violence of the conflict. Lastly on display, bayonet embedded in a tree. This bayonet was found embedded in a tree, perhaps from the effects of a shell explosion. Civil War battles battling to control the Mississippi River. Controlling Mississippi River traffic was a top strategic priority for both sides. Iowans needed the Mississippi River to take their farm goods to markets, and both sides needed the river for transportation access. Union control of the river would divide the Confederacy and isolate its western states of Arkansas and Texas. Standing in the way of this strategy were key Confederate forts that blocked river traffic for the North. Union troops and naval forces moved against Confederate defenders from each end of the river. They attacked from the mouth of the river and captured New Orleans in 1862, then moved northward. They also attacked from the north, seizing Island No. 10, Memphis, and Fort Pillow in Tennessee. Between New Orleans and Memphis lay the heavily fortified town of Vicksburg, Mississippi, the rebels' last stronghold, a crossing point for Confederate supplies, horses, and mules from Texas and Arkansas. General Grant's Army of the Tennessee, including 16 Iowa regiments or batteries, moved against Vicksburg in early 1863. The ensuing bloody campaign that ended after the siege and capture of Vicksburg on July 4th was one of the most important Union victories of the war. President Lincoln gleefully wrote, quote, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea," end quote. More than 29,000 rebel troops surrendered and lost a cache of weapons they could not replace. Their commander thought they would get better terms if they surrendered on July 4th. Union troops gave the surrendered troops food because they were starving. A rebel soldier said, quote, "What a strange spectacle of war between those who were recently deadly foes." End quote. Image 1 caption. Information provided below this Courier and Ives print demonstrates the major prize Vicksburg was to the Union. Courier and Ives, Chronicles of America. Image 2 caption. Mississippi River steamships brought arms and supplies to Union troops. Total control of river traffic proved to be an important strategic objective. Image from the Library of Congress. Image 3 caption. This Courier and Ives print demonstrates how Union naval forces used newly developed ironclad gunboats and mortar rafts during many of its Mississippi River operations, including the taking of the strategic Confederate stronghold on Island No. 10 in April of 1862, near New Madrid, Missouri. Image from the Library of Congress. An artifact on display, Siege of Vicksburg print, 1888. This 1888 chromolithograph, Siege of Vicksburg by Kurtz and Allison, shows the rugged Mississippi River bluffs and hilly terrain faced by attacking Union troops. General Grant appears at the lower right, observing the enemy with a telescope. Union troops surrounded the land around the city, and Union gunboats shelled the city from the river. The image is from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Image 4 caption. Crocker's charge at Jackson. This illustration depicts Iowa General Marcellus Crocker's charge against the rebel forces at Jackson, Mississippi, part of the Vicksburg campaign. His brigade was nicknamed Crocker's Greyhounds because they marched quickly. Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War. Quote, "It was a very solemn banquet. The outlines of our faces were pale and rigid. Our hearts were sad. Many friends had fallen since morn." End quote. And those are reflections of a soldier from 22nd Iowa while eating after the assault in which the 22nd had lost 83% of its force during the attack. Two more artifacts are on display, a sword and a watch. Colonel William T. Shaw used this sword and watch while in battle at Shiloh and Vicksburg. He eventually commanded the 14th Iowa Infantry during the Red River Campaign in 1864 in Louisiana. After indiscreetly characterizing his commanders as drunken cowards, Shaw was dismissed from the army. His dismissal was later reversed. Also on display, Capturing the Enemy's Flag. This print dramatizes the symbolic importance of capturing the enemy's flag. The exact battle shown here is unknown. As Civil War raged, Native American tribes west of Iowa fought to keep lands given to them by the American government. But broken treaties and overland westward migrations of settlers sparked intense conflict that raged during and after the Civil War. Iowa cavalry regiments opposed various Plains tribes during this time. Image 1 caption on the left. The 6th Iowa Cavalry patrolled the Dakota Territory during the Civil War. This photo was taken in 1862 and is from the collection of the State Historical Society of Iowa. Image 2 caption on the right. Recruiting notice for the 6th Iowa Cavalry to serve in the frontier west. Daily Democrat and News, Davenport, October 3, 1862, on page 3. Several artifacts are on display. The Frontier Scout, Fort Union, Dakota Territory, 1864. Published by members of the 30th Wisconsin Volunteers at Fort Union, this camp newspaper describes a major engagement between the U.S. cavalry and a Native American force in 1864. Another artifact on display, letter from Henry Wenneke. Henry Wenneke of Iowa City enlisted in the 14th Iowa Infantry. 4 companies of the 14th were assigned to the Western Theater. In early 1862, they marched from Davenport, Iowa, to Fort Randall, Dakota Territory, where they were assigned to the 6th Iowa Cavalry. In this letter to his wife, Henry includes a sketch of camp, later Fort Sully. Located near present-day Pierre, South Dakota, the fort served as garrison for soldiers of the 6th Iowa Cavalry during the Indian Wars of 1863 to 1866. Also on display, Smith 50 caliber carbine. The Smith carbine was produced from 1861 to 1865 by the American Machine Works in Springfield, Massachusetts. More than 30,000 were made, almost all going to the Union Army. It was the 4th most popular firearm produced. The 6th and 7th Iowa Cavalry were equipped with Smith carbines. Also on display, Watercolor drawing of Fort Sully, Dakota Territory, 1864, from the Library of Congress. Civil War battles, Sherman's March. After Union forces captured Vicksburg and cut the Confederacy in half, they continued to penetrate deeper into Confederate territory. The Army of the Tennessee, now commanded by General William T. Sherman, with 17 Iowa regiments, captured its first major prize in September of 1864, the strategic railroad town of Atlanta, Georgia. Sherman then proposed a daring and risky plan to sever his supply line, live off the land, and storm east through Georgia toward the important Confederate seaport town of Savannah. That 6-week campaign achieved Sherman's desired effect of further dividing the Confederacy. Sherman used a controversial approach to break the rebels' will to fight by destroying their resources and inspiring fear. Sherman ordered his troops to forage liberally in an effort to both feed his troops and to reduce the Confederates' ability to fight. In the second part of Sherman's campaign, he marched his troops north to link with Grant's army in Virginia to defeat General Lee's formidable army and finally to end the war. After he captured Savannah on Christmas Day, 1864, Sherman headed north through the Carolinas. The war ended in spring 1865 while he was in North Carolina. Image caption: General William T. Sherman of Ohio, who commanded thousands of Iowa troops, became a Union war hero and a despised figure to Southerners. Image from the Library of Congress. There's a quote also from General William T. Sherman that reads, "The hard hand of war." On display are several artifacts. Sherman's March to the Sea print, 1868. Prominent American history illustrator Felix Octavius Carr Darley created this 1868 print called Sherman's March to the Sea. Sherman wanted his troops to render rebel railroads useless, thus weakening their ability to fight. Also on display is a sword, belt, and sash. Captain Charles C. Cloutman of the 2nd Iowa Infantry Regiment died of gunfire during the Atlanta campaign. His widowed wife donated his sword, belt, and sash to the State Historical Society of Iowa. William Worth Belknap, 1829 to 1890. William Belknap, whose father was a general in the Mexican War, moved to Keokuk, Iowa from his native New York in 1851 and began practicing law. He also served in the Iowa House of Representatives. After war broke out, Belknap was commissioned a major in the 15th Iowa Infantry and fought at Shiloh, Corinth, and Vicksburg. By 1864, he had become a brigadier general and commanded the 4th Division and accompanied General Sherman during the March to the Sea. After the war, President Grant appointed Belknap Secretary of War. His post-war career was tarnished by an accusation of improper financial dealings, and he became the first cabinet secretary to be impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives, but was acquitted by the Senate. An artifact on display is the uniform of General Belknap. The coat of General William Belknap's uniform is a private purchase acquired for the Grand Review in Washington, D.C. Unusual for general officers, Belknap preferred to wear enlisted men's pants. Also on display, this Currier and Ives print dramatically depicts the Union's capture of the key city of Atlanta, Georgia. Another image on display. While serving with the 30th Iowa Infantry, William Kaufman drew this peaceful image of Lookout Mountain on the eve of the battle for the control of Chattanooga, Tennessee. The image is from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Also on display, General Grenville Dodge obtained this map shortly after the war. It shows the area in which General Sherman, with his Iowa regiments, made his last major drive of the war. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Several additional artifacts are on display, including Philip Creamer's single-shot pistol. General Belknap carried this single-shot pistol during his Civil War service. It was made between 1800 and 1820 by Philip Creamer's, a Pennsylvania-trained gunsmith who was working in Illinois, just outside St. Louis. Also on display, pommel holsters carried by General Belknap. These holsters, intended for single-shot pistols, are designed to drape across the saddle of a rider. Presentation sword given to William Belknap. This engraved and gem-encrusted sword was given to Colonel Belknap by his officers in 1864. The dedication reads, quote, "Presented to Colonel William W. Belknap, 15th Regiment Iowa Infantry Volunteers, by the officers of his regiment, June 1864, end quote. The blade is engraved with his name and an eagle surrounded by, quote, Corinth, Siege of Vicksburg, Meridian, end quote. The grip is a carved ivory figure of the goddess of war, Athena. Also on display, Model 1840 light artillery saber. Both father and son carried this saber in war. W.G. Belknap used it during the Mexican-American War. His son, W.W. Belknap, carried it during the Civil War. Also on display, English single-shot pistol. General Belknap possibly used this small pistol as a personal defense weapon. It is marked London and W. Parker. Image caption, Lieutenant Colonel Justin C. Kennedy and his 13th Iowa Infantry soldiers raised the American flag over the State House in Columbia, South Carolina, shortly after the city surrendered to Sherman's forces. Image from the Library of Congress. Below that is a quote from William Oak, which reads, "We were now ordered into camp within about 2 miles of Columbia, and little did its citizens dream that ere 48 hours their proud city would be a smoldering mass of ruins. It was at Columbia that the first ordinance of secession was passed, and dearly would its citizens pay for that treasonable act." End quote. Artifacts on display include Lee's surrender painting, created in the early 20th century. This painting commemorates Lee's surrender to Grant. Also on display, South Carolina militia officer's sword. This militia sword was surrendered to Lieutenant Henry C. MacArthur of Company K, 15th Iowa Infantry at South Carolina's capital, Columbia. Elements of the 15th Iowa were the first Union troops to enter Columbia. Also on display is a sword. Captain Joseph Yeoman served with cavalry units responsible for capturing Confederate President Jefferson Davis in Georgia. He was said to have used this sword. Civil War prisons. Both sides were totally unprepared to handle large numbers of prisoners. By the war's end, some 150 hastily planned prisons and stockades had opened throughout the country, holding an estimated total of 211,000 Union prisoners and 265,000 Confederate prisoners. 1 in 7 prisoners died, usually from starvation or disease as a result of poor care, bad hygiene, and inadequate food. Image 1 and 2 captions, the U.S. government established a 12-acre prison on Rock Island between Davenport and Moline in 1863, beginning with 468 rebels captured at Chattanooga. More than 12,000 total prisoners were incarcerated there during the war. About 2,000 died, mostly from disease. The uppermost stereographic image captures roll call at Rock Island Prison. The second image shows black and white troops guarding Confederate soldiers. The digital images of artifacts in the collection of the Rock Island Arsenal Museum are courtesy of the U.S. Army Garrison Rock Island Arsenal. Image 3 caption, Oskaloosan's Samuel Byers of the 14th Iowa Infantry escaped from a prison outside Columbia, South Carolina, by cutting a hole in a wall where he was held. After the war, Byers returned and cut around the hole to keep his unique souvenir, displayed here on the adjacent wall. While incarcerated, he wrote the words to what would become a famous song, Sherman's March to the Sea. This photo of Samuel Byers appeared in a book he wrote after the war called Iowa in War Times by Samuel Byers. Artifacts on display include Southern Prison Relic. After 15 months incarceration in Southern military prisons and after various attempts to escape being each time recaptured, S.H.M. Byers of the 5th Iowa finally made his way to liberty by cutting this hole through the wooden wall of the prison at Columbia, South Carolina, on the night of February 15, 1865. After the war, he revisited the old prison, and the officials permitted him to cut his hole from the wall through which he escaped and to bring it north. Almost 13,000 captured Union soldiers died at Andersonville, Georgia, the war's most notorious prison. At its peak, the overcrowded 27-acre site held 33,000 prisoners, including hundreds of Iowans. It is estimated that at least 200 Iowans died at Andersonville. This 1880s print captures the horrors of Andersonville in great detail. Also on display are a pipe, comb, scoop, 2 spoons, and playing card. Henry C. Parkhurst used these items while imprisoned at Andersonville. He enlisted at age 17 with the 16th Iowa Infantry. Rebels captured him at Shiloh. A prison guard gave him the clay pipe that he smoked during the entire time of his captivity. On display is a watch. David Anderson, an Ohio soldier, carried this watch during his imprisonment at Andersonville. Also on display, U.S. Sanitary Commission Badge. Johnson Brigham wore this U.S. Sanitary Commission badge during a sea voyage from Annapolis to the Savannah area to exchange prisoners with the Confederates. Brigham later moved to Des Moines, where he became a librarian and historian. On display are bone rings. Colonel Edward Lucas carved 3 bone rings while incarcerated at Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia. Lucas, the son of Territorial Governor Robert Lucas, made the initialed ring for his own son. The initials SKF refer to Samuel K. Fischel of Manchester, Iowa, a veteran of the 30th Iowa Infantry who was held at Andersonville. On display is last ration cornmeal. Joseph Fletcher, a trooper with the 9th Iowa Cavalry, saved this last ration cornmeal as a prisoner in Florence, South Carolina. He received his freedom as part of a prisoner exchange in 1864. On display is a wooden bowl. An unknown Union prisoner used this wooden bowl while at Andersonville. A note pinned to the artifact reads, quote, "A dish from which a prisoner ate his rations in Andersonville rebel prison," end quote. And lastly, on display is a pipe bowl. Prisoner M. Thomas carved this cherry root pipe bowl with a penknife while at Andersonville. What was the human toll to Americans and Iowans? More soldiers died than in all of America's other wars, from the American Revolution through the Vietnam War. Twice as many Americans died in the Civil War as in World War II. 76,000 Iowans served, almost half of the military-age male population. More than 13,000 Iowans died, more than 3,500 in battle, the rest mostly from disease. More than 8,000 Iowans were wounded. Iowa contributed 58 regiments and artillery batteries. Images 1 and 2 caption: Stereographic images of dead Confederate soldiers from trenches near Petersburg, Virginia, 1865. Image from the Library of Congress. Several artifacts are on display. Photograph of wounded veterans. These 2 unidentified veterans lost their left arms to bullet wounds. Image from Library of Congress. Prosthetic arm and patent application for artificial arm. Thousands of young men lost their arms and legs during the war. Some were able to purchase artificial limbs like the ones depicted in John Condell's patent application. Image from the National Archives. Artificial leg of Moses DeMarce. Moses DeMarce, who served in Company A, 25th Iowa Infantry, took part in General Sherman's march across Georgia. In March of 1865, he was shot in the right knee at the Battle of Bentonville, North Carolina, a wound that necessitated amputation of his leg. Following the war, the government issued him this mass-produced prosthetic limb. Iowa's Medal of Honor recipients. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military honor, originated during the Civil War. On December 9, 1861, at the request of the Secretary of the Navy, Senator James Wilson Grimes of Iowa introduced a bill to create this medal for distinguished gallant service for sailors. The bill passed, and similar legislation was passed for the Army. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration awarded by United States government. It recognizes conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his or her life above and beyond the call of duty. Over 50 Iowans were awarded the Medal of Honor during the Civil War. On display are 2 different styles of the Medal of Honor. 1862 style Medal of Honor. Corporal George W. Healy was awarded the Medal of Honor for disarming and capturing 5 Confederate soldiers and bringing them to the Union lines. Corporal Healy served in Company E, 5th Iowa Cavalry. His actions occurred during the Atlanta Campaign in July 1864. 1904 style Medal of Honor. Sergeant Luther Kaltenbach was awarded the Medal of Honor for capturing the flag of the 44th Mississippi Infantry, Confederate States of America, at Nashville, Tennessee, on December 16, 1864. Sergeant Kaltenbach served in Company F, 12th Iowa Infantry. The Medal of Honor shown here was reissued to Kaltenbach in 1904 and is the second design for the medal. Image caption: Iowa in the Civil War, Camps and Campaigns. The country celebrated the Civil War's centennial in the 1960s. This illustrated map, drawn by cartoonist Frank Miller, was created by the Des Moines Register for its coverage and was used in the museum at the time. Images from the State Historical Society of Iowa. On the wall is a video slideshow titled Aftermath. Text from the video reads, Farm machinery. Half the male population of Iowa fighting in the Civil War encouraged farmers to utilize new labor-saving machinery. Machinery for planting, cultivating, and harvesting replaced the manual labor of those who were off at war. Image caption: The Kirby Harvester, State Agricultural Society. Disease. 8,000 Iowans died in the Civil War from disease alone. Twice as many Iowans died from disease than in battle. The toll from disease emphasized the need to focus on prevention and treatment. Image caption: Cemetery with many rows of tombstones. Orphans. The hidden casualties of war were thousands of orphans. Soldiers pleaded for Iowans to, quote, look after our wives and children, our mothers and sisters, who are dependent upon us for support, end quote, moving Annie Wittenmeyer to establish the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home. Image 1 caption, Young Girl, from the Library of Congress. Image 2 caption, Orphanage, from the Davenport Public Library. Veterans. Even when the war was over, the suffering continued. Iowa responded to the deluge of returning veterans, many unable to care for themselves, by establishing the Iowa Soldiers' Home, which continues to this day. Image 1 caption, Veterans sitting around a tree, from the National Archives. Image 2 caption, Iowa Soldiers' Home, Marshalltown, Iowa, from Beveridge and Jessup. Politics. The party of Lincoln won on the battlefield and at the ballot box. Lincoln's Republican Party dominated the Iowa legislature and governorship, with one exception, until the 1930s. Image caption, Governors of Iowa from 1864 to 1993. Memorials. Iowa communities welcomed new soldiers and statesmen, made of stone and steel. Communities across the state erected dozens of monuments to honor those who fought and died. Image 1, 2, and 3 caption include 3 monuments. Camaraderie. The war may be over, but the Grand Army of the Republic of the Army marched on. The GAR was the most prominent among many groups that fostered continued unity among war veterans. Image caption, Reunion in Centerville, Iowa, 1888, 3rd Iowa Cavalry Regiment, from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Citizenship. In 1868, the Iowa Constitution was amended to give African American men the right to vote. Women still had to wait until 1919. Image caption, The First Vote, from the Library of Congress. Equality. Even as the bloodshed ended, the struggle for equal rights was just beginning. The end of battle signaled the beginning of a century-long struggle for African Americans to enjoy citizenship in the fullest sense of the word. Image caption, March for Equal Rights, from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Education. The battle for equality in education was won in Iowa courtrooms. African Americans in Iowa won the right to attend public schools through a series of court cases in the late 1860s and 1870s. Image caption, George Washington Carver, from the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Grand Army of the Republic. Even as the Civil War was concluding, veterans groups were established to preserve the comradeship, personal friendships, and shared memories formed in combat. The Grand Army of the Republic, GAR, was the most prominent of these organizations. The 1st Iowa Department, or the GAR, was formed in 1866, reorganized in 1879, and lasted until 1947. In 1883, a women's auxiliary, the Women's Relief Corps, WRC, was formed to support the GAR's mission. Iowa, like most states, established veterans' homes and hospitals within a few decades after the war. The Iowa Veterans Home opened in Marshalltown, Iowa in 1887, at a time when Civil War veterans were growing older and many needed housing and medical care. Several artifacts are on display. A metal ballot box. GAR members would vote with black and white marbles in local elections with ballot boxes such as this one. The meaning of the initials is unknown. The canteen was made to resemble those used by soldiers during the war. Wood ballot box. This GAR ballot box features a miniature cannon to remind members of the war. GAR grave marker. Grave markers such as these bearing the GAR symbol are commonly found in cemeteries all across Iowa. They serve as reminders of proud military service. GAR badges. All GAR members were issued membership badges like the one shown here, which bears the GAR symbol and letters. A GAR post commander wore this badge on either his coat or hat. Army of the Tennessee commander William T. Sherman gave his GAR badge to his Iowa friend Samuel Byers, the author of Sherman's March to the Sea. Miniature siege mortar. This miniature siege mortar is made from melted down bullets gathered from the Petersburg, Virginia battlefield. It was formerly found in a GAR post. Ceramic canteen. This decorative ceramic canteen was owned by a proud delegate of the Davenport encampment. The Davenport post was named for Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Wentz, the first Scott County resident to die in the war. He was shot at the Battle of Belmont. Souvenir canteen. The GAR designated this souvenir canteen for Dr. David B. Hillis, who commanded the 17th Iowa Infantry. And gavels. The inscription on this gavel honors the brave Crocker Brigade that fought aggressively at the Battle of Shiloh. The second gavel is from a Mason City GAR post, which bears engravings identifying members' participation in the Battle of Chickamauga, Georgia. The third, members of this GAR post used a gavel that identifies General Joseph Hooker, their commander at the Battle of Lookout Mountain, Tennessee. Image caption. Former enemies exchange a friendly handshake at a reunion of the famous Battle of Gettysburg in 1938. Image from the National Archives. Multiple artifacts are on display, including Women's Relief Corps badges, Women's Relief Corps ribbons. The WRC distributed these ribbons to members at meetings, some occurring as much as 60 years after the war. Images of Marie Basham and Mary McHenry on these ribbons demonstrate Iowans' national leadership roles in this organization. Women's Relief Corps notebook. Souvenir canteen. This miniature souvenir canteen is from a national WRC meeting in 1895, 30 years after the war ended. It bears a notable slogan of brotherhood and sisterhood, quote, "We drank from the same canteen," end quote. Souvenir spoon from 1922 WRC meeting in Des Moines. Liberty Bell replica. The WRC underscored its members' patriotic efforts by commissioning this miniature replica of the famous Liberty Bell in 1938. Business cards of Marie Basham of Iowa, the National WRC Secretary in the 1930s. And finally, two books on display. The first, History 1884 to 1934, Department of Iowa Women's Relief Corps, Auxiliary to the Grand Army of the Republic. This history of Iowa's Women's Relief Corps provides names of past and present officers and documents their activities while preserving the memories of many Iowa veterans. The second book, WRC Instruction Book. This book offers WRC members instructions for conducting installation services, burials, and inspections. African American migration. The post-Civil War call for citizenship was led by Iowa's Black Civil War veterans, and in particular, Alexander Clark of Muscatine, who had helped organize the 60th Colored Regiment. They felt that since they had taken up arms in defense of liberty, they should enjoy all the rights and privileges of full citizenship. In 1868, Iowans amended the state constitution to extend suffrage to African American men. Image caption: One of the great legacies of the Civil War was the amendment to the U.S. Constitution that granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people. This sketch, made by Alfred R. Waud, shows a line of black men voting freely for the first time in the South, shortly after the war ended, from Harper's Weekly, 1867. A quote reads, "I am a man, have enjoyed citizenship 2 days out of 40 years, and from the fullness of a grateful heart, I beg leave to thank the young voters of our state for the substantial test they have given to our sympathy for freedom, by extending to the colored man the right of suffrage." A quote from Alfred Nuckol's Iowa City. Artifacts on display include binoculars and case. These binoculars were brought home from the war by John Alexander Joyner, a free African American who served as a cook with the 38th Wisconsin Infantry. After the war, Joyner moved his family from Illinois to a small farm in Saylor Township, Polk County, Iowa, where he resided until his death. The Joyner family was typical of many African American families who migrated to Iowa after the Civil War. They lived much like their white neighbors, contributing to their communities. Also on display are 3 African spoons. These spoons were brought back to Iowa by John Joyner's daughter, who in the early 20th century served as a missionary for the African Methodist Episcopal Church in what is now South Africa. Image caption: The quest for equal opportunity in education in Iowa involved a series of court cases in the late 1860s and 1870s, when African Americans in Iowa were granted the right to attend public schools. One of the first to do so was Susan Clark, daughter of Alexander Clark, who sued the Muscatine School Board to be allowed to attend her neighborhood school. Other cases in Keokuk in the mid-1870s continued the path toward desegregation of Iowa's schools. By 1885, Susan Mosley, a formerly enslaved person, would attend local schools and become the first black graduate of Iowa Wesleyan University. By the 1880s, African Americans in Iowa had acquired most of the legal rights of citizenship, at least for men. It would take more than 100 years of struggle to obtain full citizenship rights. This unidentified black soldier and family represent the millions of African Americans freed from slavery who became citizens. Image from the Library of Congress. Soldiers' Daily Life, Civil War Encampment Recreation. On display is a recreation of a Civil War encampment, including an officer's tent, shelter tent, cooking pit and cooking equipment, outdoor table with chess set, a trunk, letter writing equipment and paper, and hardtack boxes. On the wall is a Mulligan's Brigade poster, and also a poster of regulations for Camp Defiance. In addition, an image with the caption of "Life in Camp Cameron, Washington, D.C., May 1861," from Brady's National Photographic Portrait Galleries, Library of Congress. Around the corner after the encampment recreation is an image on the wall with the caption of "Soldiers' Daily Life." Life in camp was pretty boring for most Civil War soldiers. The day would begin with reveille at about 4:30 a.m., followed by breakfast. If a soldier were on campaign, he would need to be ready to march by 5 a.m. If he were in camp, he would either be marching or drilling, both of which were very uncomfortable during the heat of summer. At night, soldiers would play games or cards, write letters, or read. Sometimes they would recite passages to their fellow soldiers. Many enjoyed smoking and whittling as well, but for the most part, a soldier's life was just plain boring. A quote from William Oak, while camped in winter at Milligan's Bend, reads, quote, "After establishing our camp, the months of February and March were weary months for the troops, 1863, the monotony of camp life being more irksome to the soldier than being on an active campaign." End quote. Artifacts on display include a chest of camp items. General William Belknap of Keokuk used this chest of camp items to prepare his meals and to store personal items. The items include metal boxes, glass bottles, a metal rasp, spice shakers, and ceramic and metal cups. Image caption: General William Belknap of Keokuk, Iowa, is shown here with 2 aides. Image from the Library of Congress. Also on display is an Ambrose stove. Colonel J.V. Myers, an Iowan, used this portable Ambrose stove. His aide would make a fire underneath the stove, which served as an oven, with an attached water heater. Also on display, game equipment. Many games, such as checkers, chess, and dominoes, were popular with soldiers of both sides. Cribbage was played with homemade boards like the one shown here. Tin candle and match holder. This portable candle holder could be used in a small tent by a soldier. Writing equipment. Both sides possessed good postal service. Soldiers wrote often to their families and sweethearts using pencils or pens. Ink was supplied in various containers of wood, pottery, and glass. Shaving equipment. Soldiers and officers supplied their own shaving gear. Typical are this tin shaving mug, wood soap box, and straight razor. Pipe bowl carved by W. B. Mitchell. William B. Mitchell served in Company F, 47th Iowa Infantry, which was a 100-day regiment formed in July of 1864. Having served mainly in Arkansas, the regiment was mustered out in September of the same year. Sewing kit, or soldier's housewife. A, quote, soldier's housewife, end quote, provided the thread and needles needed to maintain a soldier's clothes. Whittling and carving. Many soldiers used off time to create trinkets for loved ones or friends. This small wood ring was carved at the Bull Run battlefield. Folding memo book. Small folding weekly memo books made of ivory were popular with soldiers. Mahogany and yellow poplar book box. Burned into the bottom of this handmade book box is the following inscription, quote, "This book was made at Savannah, Georgia, between Christmas 1863 and May 1864 by Arch Pearson of Carlisle, Warren County, Iowa, while serving in the Civil War in Company B, 10th Iowa Infantry. Burned by Mrs. E. Pearson." Image caption, Hiram Kersey of the 44th Iowa Infantry, with his musket and revolver, from the Library of Congress. Feeding soldiers. Feeding troops was a vitally important and difficult responsibility, especially in getting food to armies on the move. Storage and preservation of food was also a concern. Thus, troops got cured, salted meats and dried and pressed fruits and vegetables. Most Union troops strongly disliked army bread, or hardtack, but because these cracker-like, rock-solid squares were easy to ship and to store, they were a main staple. On display includes utensils used by an unknown Union soldier, including metal spoons, forks, and knives, a tin bowl and cup from the Civil War area. Joseph Teggy, 26th Iowa Infantry Regiment, saved this hardtack as a souvenir. Lieutenant Henry MacArthur, 15th Iowa Volunteer Infantry, saved this hardtack brought back from the battlefield. While serving in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Private Christopher Kellogg of the 21st Iowa Volunteer Infantry received these portions of hardtack. Iowan Henry O. Wheeler, who served in the 18th Iowa Infantry Regiment, ate with these utensils. Tin pail coffee boiler circa 1850. Soldiers typically brewed coffee in pots such as this one made in West Amana. Equipping soldiers. A 100,000 soldier army needed 600 tons of supplies every day. Among these supplies were tents, which slept 2 soldiers, and food. Most who fought in the war were young farmers in their 20s. Most of the 600,000 who died had not yet reached their 25th birthday. However, boys as young as 14, along with hundreds of women disguised as men, were known to have served in the war. Men of advanced age did their part as well. Iowa had a regiment of graybeards, the 37th Iowa Volunteer Infantry, composed of soldiers over 45, some of whom were 80 years of age, who performed guard and garrison duty. Image caption, Soldiers of Company H, 7th Iowa Volunteer Infantry pose at Corinth, Mississippi in 1862. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Several artifacts are on display. Union uniform of Private Alfred Wilder, Company I, 30th Iowa Infantry. This enlisted man's frock coat conforms to the 1855 regulations and was a type worn by many Iowa soldiers. Model 1864 leather cartridge box. This cartridge box could be worn either on a sling or on the belt. U.S. Model 1858 forage cap. This was the most widely used form of headgear for Union soldiers. The cap features the bugle symbol of the infantry. Canteen. Next in importance to food was drink. Canteens were mainly for water. Regulation canteens were made of pressed tin with a canvas or burlap cover and a cotton strap. Haversack. The haversack was a cloth bag with a strap that was used to carry a soldier's rations or food. Tin cup. Most soldiers carried some version of the standard tin cup. They had multiple functions from drinking cup to cooking pot. Leather cap box. This cap box contained percussion caps and was worn on the belt. Wool blanket. Soldiers carried either an army-issued blanket or a personal one. Regulation knapsack. The knapsack was designed to carry a soldier's basic needs, such as a blanket, a ground cloth, a shelter half, extra clothes, and personal accessories. The knapsack was made of tarred canvas with leather straps. Image caption: This Union soldier wears an oilcloth-covered kepi. Library of Congress. Image caption: This soldier proudly displays his Springfield along with his Bowie knives and pistols. Image from the Library of Congress. Muskets and rifles. Civil War infantry long arms were primarily of two types, muskets and rifle muskets. Muskets are muzzle-loading, smooth-bore long arms. Rifle muskets are muzzle-loading long arms with a rifled barrel in approximately .58 caliber. Iowa troops were equipped with a variety of each type. Paper cartridges and percussion caps. It took two elements to fire a Civil War rifle musket: paper cartridges and percussion caps. The ammunition was loaded by tearing the paper, pouring the powder down the barrel, ramming the ball down the barrel with a ramrod, cocking the hammer, and inserting a percussion cap on the exposed nipple. Image caption: This Union soldier displays his short-barreled carbine in his left hand. Image from the Library of Congress. Carbines. The carbine, a shoulder arm shorter than a rifle or musket, was the essential weapon of the Civil War cavalry trooper. Since they were in short supply, manufacturers rushed to meet wartime demand. By war's end, the U.S. Army had adopted no fewer than 17 different makes. Iowa units were equipped with a variety of makes. Revolvers. Also on display are multiple examples of revolvers used during the Civil War. Image caption: An unknown Iowa cavalryman poses in Des Moines. Pearson and Nesbitt, East Des Moines. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Second image caption: An unidentified lieutenant poses on his horse with his saber ready for action. Image from the Library of Congress. Model 1860 Cavalry Saber of Benjamin Owen. This was the standard issued saber used by the U.S. cavalry units. Captain Benjamin Owen served in Company H, 2nd Iowa Cavalry. Model 1859 McClellan Saddle, 2nd Iowa Cavalry. This style of McClellan saddle was used by the U.S. cavalry throughout the Civil War. Pair of Confederate spurs. The letters C and S are cast into these brass spurs. They were probably made by Leach and Rigdon of Memphis, Tennessee. Pair of spurs. These are standard issue enlisted men's spurs worn by cavalry and horse artillery. Model 1859 U.S. Cavalry horse bit. This was the standard issue horse bit with the U.S. rosettes on both cheeks. Cavalry carbine socket. This black leather donut held the muzzle to the saddle of a variety of Civil War carbines. The carbine was attached to the carbine sling over the cavalryman's shoulder. Regulation cavalry trooper's jacket. This was the standard cavalry trooper's short jacket with yellow piping, indicating cavalry. This jacket was worn by Sergeant John Wesley Jones, Company E, 4th Iowa Cavalry. Regulation cavalry overcoat or greatcoat. This was the standard mounted soldier's coat with an attached cape. Civil War music. The Civil War produced a rich musical legacy. Sounds from bugles, drums, and fifes represented orders to march. Some music made marching itself easier and boosted the morale of tired troops. In camp, music could be a fun diversion from tedium, homesickness, or boredom. Regiments could have brass bands, and most did. Image 1 caption: The Little Drummer Boy of 62 shows young Thomas W. Cox, who accompanied Company G, 33rd Iowa Infantry throughout the war. Family legend says this adventurous 13-year-old was personally recruited because of his musical talent. This is from a painting by Gerhard Nolan, a Dutch artist who lived in Pella, Iowa. He made this portrait from a photograph. Image from the Pella Historical Society. Image 2 caption. Harper's Weekly printed this drawing dramatizing different Civil War songs. Image from the Library of Congress. Image 3 caption. John White's 11th Iowa Infantry Regimental Band posed for this photograph at an unknown location during the Civil War. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Image 4 caption. Unidentified Union drummer from the Library of Congress. Image 5 caption. The 2nd Iowa Regimental Band stands posed, ready to play. Image from the Carnegie Historical Museum in Fairfield, Iowa. Image 6 caption. All hail to the flag of freedom from the Library of Congress. Image 7 caption. The Battle Cry of Freedom by Geo F. Root from the Library of Congress. Several artifacts are on display, including Civil War drums. Union and Confederate soldiers communicated directions in camp and on the battlefield using drums. Drummers learned dozens of drum calls, and each call told the soldiers to perform a specific task. The image of the Little Drummer Boy of 62 shows young Thomas W. Cox, who accompanied Company G of the 33rd Iowa Infantry. The work was painted by Gerhard Nolan, a Dutch artist who lived in Pella. This type of snare drum and side drum were typically used by Union armies. Civil War bugles. The bugle proved more suitable than a drum or fife as a signaling instrument during battle. It was less shrill and louder. Its sound carried farther and was less likely to blend in with battle sounds. Civil War fifes. Similar to the drum and bugle, a fife was used to signal instructions such as lights out, bedtime, and sound reveille, time to wake up. Also on display, sword. The Army issued swords, such as the one shown here, to musicians for ceremonial purposes. Guitar. Soldiers played guitars like this one to break the tedium of camp life. On the back of the case are 4 examples of music posters from the time period. They include Hail, Glorious Banner of Our Land, Spirit of the Union, sheet music from Library of Congress, Sherman's March to the Sea, words by S.H.M. Byers, music by J.O. Rockwell, sheet music from the Library of Congress, Pea Ridge March, composed by Christoph Bach, sheet music from Library of Congress, and Star Spangled Banner, sheet music from the Library of Congress. Photograph of bugler from the Library of Congress. Black soldiers join the Army. When President Lincoln's controversial Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1, 1863, it allowed free African Americans to join the armed services, even though vast numbers of Americans were either skeptical or openly hostile to the idea of armed black soldiers. But black soldiers did indeed join the needy Union Army in large numbers. They were organized in separate all-black regiments led by white officers. Almost 200,000 African Americans became soldiers and left a legacy of distinction. Several artifacts are on display, including the Proclamation of Emancipation. Image 1 caption. Iowa contributed 1 black regiment to the U.S. Army, the 1st Iowa Colored Infantry Regiment, renamed the 60th U.S. Regiment of Infantry, United States Colored Volunteers. Alexander Clark Sr. of Muscatine, one of Iowa's leading black citizens, helped form this regiment. He recruited volunteers from both Iowa and Missouri. Led by white officers, the custom of the time, this unit performed garrison duties in Helena, Arkansas. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Image 2 caption. This is an image of the flag that was made by African American women in Muscatine and Keokuk, part of the collection of the Iowa Battle Flag Project of the State Historical Society of Iowa. Image 3 caption. This dramatic image depicts black troops fighting in their first large-scale action at Port Hudson, Louisiana. To many at the time, this engagement settled the question as to whether black soldiers would fight effectively. Image from the Library of Congress. Image 4 caption. An unidentified African American soldier poses at the Benton Barracks near St. Louis. Image from the Library of Congress. Hospital horrors and Civil War medicine. Inadequately trained Army hospital staffs were largely unable to handle the immense scale of casualties brought on by the Civil War. In fact, hospitals suffered dismal reputations for their poor care. Wounded soldiers usually dreaded going to a field hospital because it was as much a death sentence as going into battle. Gunshot wounds to limbs caused breaks because the potent Minet ball found in most rifles would crush and shatter bones that could not be mended. Union doctors performed an estimated 30,000 amputations. 1/4 of those procedures ended in death. A quote from Iowan William Oak at Milliken's Bend winter camp. Quote, "While lying encamped, there was a good deal of sickness, the soldiers dying by scores. On awakening in the morning and looking towards the regimental hospital, we could generally see 1 or 2 cots outside in the rear, with a blanket thrown over them, covering the forms of soldiers that had died during the night." End quote. Image 1 caption. Union soldiers recover in a hospital around 1863. Image from the National Archives. Image 2 caption. Union surgeons amputate a soldier's leg. Image from the Library of Congress. Image 3 caption. A Union lieutenant killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville, Virginia, was shot in the leg, and this ball was embedded in his amputated femur, as shown in this photo from a medical text. Image from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. Image 4 caption. This image of how to conduct an amputation was taken from a manual for Union Army doctors. Image from the Library of Congress. Image 5 caption. Wounded soldiers rest at a field hospital. The man sitting on the left lost part of his right arm. Image from the National Archives. Dangers of infection. A shot to the gut, chest, or head meant certain death. One of the main reasons for this was the risk of infection because doctors did not know what caused infections. Discoveries about bacteria, viruses, and proper hygienic practices were yet to be made. No one knew that decomposing garbage, spoiled food, and human waste were breeding grounds for disease-causing organisms. Artifacts on display include Field Hospital 1st Division, 6th Corps near Petersburg, Virginia, winter of 1864 and 1865. A wounded soldier enters a field hospital at Petersburg, Virginia, where both armies suffered thousands of casualties during the Union siege of this town near the Confederate capital of Richmond. Crutches. Lieutenant Henry MacArthur, 15th Iowa Volunteer Infantry, made these crutches to use during his recovery from a hip wound suffered during the Atlanta Campaign in 1864. Bandage. A veteran saved this rolled bandage, which was used to cover and heal wounds. Sword and scabbard, an officer's sash. Even doctors needed weapons because their work could take them near the battlefield. A Union medical officer used this sword and scabbard, an officer's sash. Stethoscope. During the Civil War, doctors used this relatively newly invented stethoscope to determine the condition of a patient's lungs and heart. Lancet. Surgeons used this knife-like lancet to make small incisions and punctures to drain infected wounds. Medical kit, Major William Huston. Major William Huston, 32nd Iowa Infantry Regiment, used this kit during the Civil War. It contained saws, knives, and sutures. Seashell frame, J.W. Colcord. Wounded Union soldier J.W. Colcord made this seashell-framed photo of himself during his recovery. He served in a Massachusetts unit and probably moved to Iowa after the war. Medical kit, Dr. Charles H. Lothrop. Dr. Charles H. Lothrop, who served in the Union Army from 1862 to the end of the war, performed administrative duties with his field desk. He also performed amputations on many Iowa soldiers with the tools in this kit. From the State Historical Society of Iowa. Sewing kit, nameplate, and identification disc. Soldiers' personal items included this sewing kit and brass stenciled nameplate belonging to Iowa soldier Samuel Green, an identification disc belonging to W.H. Olney, 2nd Iowa Infantry, and a cross used by a New York soldier named Henry O. Wheeler, who moved to Iowa after the war. Espionage. Both sides used spies to obtain information about the size and movement of enemy armies. Iowa General Grenville Dodge effectively headed intelligence operations in the war's Western Theater. He managed to obtain crucial information at Vicksburg and during the Atlanta campaign that contributed to Union victories. Dodge employed more than 100 agents. These men and women, including African Americans, performed life-threatening duties, and unlike prisoners of war, they faced execution if captured. Image caption: General Grenville Dodge of Council Bluffs was probably Iowa's most notable soldier. His service as a spy was but one of many distinguished acts he conducted during the war. After the war, he was a leader in the building of the first transcontinental railroad. This is from The Iowa Colonels and Regiments by A. Stewart, 1865. Several artifacts are on display, including a handwritten note by General Grenville Dodge from July 25, 1864. Leather-bound books, General Grenville Dodge, used these two leather-bound books to record intelligence information from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Confederate pistol. Union forces seized this pistol from an unsuccessful Confederate spy. Organizing the Army. Image caption: Captain A. Scott Jordan, image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Several artifacts are on display: uniform, saber, sword, and field desk. Captain A. Scott Jordan of Fairfield, Iowa, served with the 19th Iowa Volunteer Infantry. He wore this uniform and carried this saber. His men honored his leadership by presenting him with this sword. Jordan performed administrative duties with this easily transportable field desk. Folding camp chair. Colonel H. J. B. Cummings of the 29th Iowa Volunteer Infantry used this folding camp chair as his unit participated in major actions with the Army of the Tennessee. Union Generals of the Army of the Tennessee print, 1890. This print by James E. Taylor of New York shows the main Union generals of the Army of the Tennessee, including Iowa's General Grenville Dodge. Learning War. Image 1 caption: A Des Moines cavalry troop is mounted and leaving for the battlefield. This print was published in Harper's Weekly. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Image 2 caption: Harper's Weekly printed this sketch by Dubuque artist Alexander Simplot in September 1861 as thousands of Iowans volunteered for the war. Camp Warren was located in the Mississippi River town of Burlington, Iowa. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Image 3 caption: Soldiers board a steamboat at Bellevue, Iowa on the Mississippi River. They are headed for training camps in Keokuk or points farther south in Missouri. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Image 4 caption: After mustering for service, most Iowans were transported by steamboat down the Mississippi River to Benton Barracks near St. Louis, or to camps in Cairo, Illinois, to begin to learn soldiering. Harper's Weekly. Several artifacts are on display. Revised Regulations of the Army of the United States, 1861. All armies run on rules. Captain Scott Jordan of Fairfield, Iowa, used this book of U.S. Army regulations during his service. Regulations for the Subsistence Department of the Army of the United States, 1862. The cover reads, Regulations for the Subsistence Department of the Army of the United States, Washington, Government Printing Office, 1862. Model 1840 Pomeroy Contract Musket, 69 caliber. This type of musket, which was issued early in the war to many Iowa units, was carried at the Battle of Shiloh by Sanford Burke, Company H, 6th Iowa Infantry. Carved into the stock of the musket is his company and regiment designation. Burke survived a wound he received during the battle and was transferred to the 4th U.S. Cavalry. National Guard Manual, 1864. Principles and Maxims of the Art of War, 1863. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard wrote this contemporary update of the famous work by Chinese General Sun Tzu. Beauregard's version was published in Charleston, South Carolina. Also on display are several instruction manuals, including Rules for the Management and Cleaning of the Rifle Musket, Model 1855, Rules for the Management and Cleaning of the Rifle Musket, Model 1863, and 1852 Manual of the Bayonet Exercise. Civilians to soldiers. Most Iowa troops mustered into military service at camps established in Mississippi River towns. Few had experience in drilling, marching, use of weapons, and obeying orders. Troops commonly elected their lieutenants and captains, especially early in the war. Image 1 caption: This illustration shows fresh volunteers assembling for drills from battles and leaders of the Civil War. Image 2 caption: Unknown Iowa soldier stands at attention with his rifle. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. A quote reads, "We all mustered on the village green. Alas, not half of them were ever to see that village green again." Quote from Samuel Byers. Several artifacts are on display. List of the officers mustered into the service of U.S. 1st Regiment of Volunteers, Iowa, 1861. The 1st Regiment formed in response to President Lincoln's first call for troops on April 15, 1861. The regiment enlisted for only 90 days. When that period ended, most of the members re-enlisted for 3 years' service in other regiments. Unknown Army Camp near Council Bluffs, 1861 to 1862. This drawing by Iowa artist George Simons may represent either Camp Kirkwood or Camp Dodge, both training camps near Council Bluffs. Camp Kirkwood was the training camp for the 4th Iowa Infantry and General Grenville Dodge. U.S. Model 1816 Contract Musket. This musket was made by L. Pomeroy of Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and was changed from flintlock ignition to percussion in 1833. At the beginning of the Civil War, Iowa's arsenals contained out-of-date muskets like these. Parker's Snow Rifle, made in Connecticut, used by a soldier of the 16th Iowa Infantry. Model 1840 Cavalry Saber, used in the 2nd Iowa Cavalry. Model 1854 Austrian Lorenz Rifle Musket. Thousands of these rifle muskets were imported by both sides during the war. These weapons did not have a very good reputation among the soldiers. They tended to be unreliable and had severe recoil, like being kicked by a mule, that hurt the soldier's shoulder when fired. Model 1854 Volcanic Pistol. Many soldiers, especially officers, brought their own weapons to use. Benjamin Owen used this unusual, privately purchased pistol during his service in the 2nd Iowa Cavalry. 1861 Wood Practice Swords. Facing severe shortages of material at the beginning of the war, Iowa troops were forced to train with wooden substitutes. Benjamin Owen used these 2 swords as he trained with the 2nd Iowa Cavalry. Appointment of Harvey Graham as 1st Lieutenant to Company B, 1st Regiment, Iowa Volunteers. Harvey Graham was a successful millwright from Iowa City. He served with the 1st Iowa Infantry at the Battle of Wilson's Creek and was wounded while commanding Company B. He later enlisted in the 22nd Iowa Infantry and became its commander during its service with General Sheridan in Virginia. Graham lived in Iowa City after the war. Uniform coat and shoulder straps of Harvey Graham. This may be the uniform coat of the Washington Guards, an Iowa City militia unit that enlisted in the 1st Regiment. Harvey Graham was a member of the Washington Guards. Artifacts on display include recruiting posters. This billboard from Lee County, Iowa, gives reasons to join the Union Army. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Also on display, Rifle Scouts recruiting poster. This 1862 poster is recruiting for a Missouri unit, the 14th Missouri Infantry, also known as Burge's Western Sharpshooters. The recruiter appeals to the recruit's ego and suggests an easy Army life with no guard duty. Baker's Dragoons Recruiting Handbill, August 20, 1861. Many times local companies were named after the local sponsor of the unit. 1861 Keokuk Recruiting Poster. This poster points out a problem with recruiting in Iowa, competition from other states. General Orders Number 33 and Number 37 remind Iowans that it is unlawful to join up with non-Iowa units. Elisha Leeming Bible. Elisha Leeming of Company C, 15th Iowa Infantry, was clear about his reasons for fighting. He wrote in his Bible, quote, "This book presented to me by Reverend Josiah Hopkins in 1861 in the war against slavery." Answering the call. War began when Confederate forces fired cannons on Fort Sumter at Charleston, South Carolina. In response, President Lincoln asked the states for volunteers to put down the Southern Rebellion. Iowans responded enthusiastically. Iowa started from scratch to organize, feed, arm, and clothe its troops. Governor Kirkwood, along with other well-to-do Iowans, pledged personal funds to begin the process. The state eventually spent millions to support the war effort. Thousands of young Iowa men volunteered, expecting a short war. They went for different reasons, including seeking adventure, opposing secession that they viewed as traitorous, deploring slavery, and joining friends. The first enlistment period lasted 90 days, but after initial fighting proved that the war would last much longer than originally thought, President Lincoln called for a 3-year enlistment. The federal government did institute a draft, but few Iowans were drafted. Instead, they continued to volunteer because they felt it was dishonorable to be drafted. Artifacts on display include an April 17, 1861 telegram and other telegrams requesting troops from April 16 through 18, 1861. After the April 12th attack on Fort Sumter, President Lincoln sent out a request for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion. Iowa's share was 1 regiment, about 800 to 1,000 men. On April 16th, Iowa Governor Samuel Kirkwood received official notice of the call for troops from the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron. This group of telegrams reflects the progress of the request, as well as instructions on where to send the newly called-up troops. Wide Awake's banner. Republicans organized marching clubs called Wide Awakes to keep order at political rallies and to work for the overall good of the party. This banner was a message to Wide Awakes in Washington, Iowa. Medallion. Triumphant Republicans created this medallion for their champion, Abraham Lincoln, and his 1816 running mate, Hannibal Hamlin. Walking cane with rail splitter carving. The small rail splitter carving on this walking cane refers to Abraham Lincoln's campaign image as a common man accustomed to performing common labor, such as splitting rails to build fences. Electoral tickets. These election tickets promoted the 3 main contenders in the 1860 presidential election: Republican Abraham Lincoln, Democrat Stephen Douglas, and John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party. Secession. 11 states formed their own country. The future of slavery was the biggest issue facing Americans during the 1860 presidential election, won by Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. Southern alarm over Lincoln's opposition to slavery's expansion — he did not favor abolition — sparked the beginning of the secession. Image caption: Jefferson Davis, pictured in this newspaper story, became President of the Confederate State of America. Image from the Library of Congress. Quote, but an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations and the laws of the general government. The states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa have enacted laws which either nullify the acts of Congress or render useless any attempt to execute them. From the Declaration of the Immediate Causes which Induce and Justify the Secession of South Carolina from the Federal Union, December 24, 1860. A second quote reads, I had been for many months on a plantation in Mississippi, and there with my own eyes had seen the horrors of slavery. I had seen human beings flogged, men and women bleeding from an overseer's lash, and the war, they tell us, to perpetuate this curse. End quote. From a speech in Newton, Iowa by Samuel Byers, who later became a Union soldier. A print on the wall reads, Quaker abolitionist poet John Greenleaf Whittier wrote John Brown of Osawatomie about Brown's execution. This print by T.S. Noble dramatizes one stanza. Quote, John Brown of Osawatomie, they led him out to die, and lo, a poor slave mother with her little child pressed nigh. Then the bold blue eye grew tender, and the old harsh face grew mild, as he stooped between the jeering ranks and kissed the Negro's child. End quote. Above an image of Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel dramatized the great injustice of slavery. This influential bestseller strengthened the abolitionist cause and frightened and angered many Southerners and enslavers who feared abolition. Image from the Library of Congress. Coming apart. The Civil War tore away America's threads of unity. A common language, constitution, history, and political institutions could not prevent the violent rift between Northerners and Southerners. Compromise and conciliation finally gave way to war on a scale not experienced by Americans since then. It was a conflict over ideals, most of which were related directly or indirectly to the institution of slavery. Image caption. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 effectively dissolved the 1820 Missouri Compromise that prohibited slavery in states above Missouri's southern border. This act sparked a wave of violence throughout sparsely settled Kansas between pro-slavery border ruffians and anti-slavery free state settlers who could vote to decide whether or not to allow slavery. As conflict raged over the future of bloody Kansas, abolitionist John Brown rose to national fame in 1856 after he and 4 of his sons murdered pro-slavery settlers in response to pro-slavery attacks on free state settlers throughout Kansas. Northern abolitionists admired him as a champion opponent of slavery. To Southerners, he was an arch-fiend bent on ruining Southern society. Image from the Library of Congress. Quote, I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood, end quote, said by John Brown, stated just before he was executed. Artifacts on display include a John Brown portrait. Iowa City artist Isaac Weatherby painted this portrait of John Brown at the request of William Maxon of Springdale, Iowa. Model 1842 Harper's Ferry musket. This model 1842 Harper's Ferry musket, a common Army weapon, was made at the Harper's Ferry Arsenal. It was reportedly used by John Brown's men prior to their departure to Harper's Ferry, where they conducted their famous raid. Wooden sword. John Brown's men used this wooden sword to practice for their Harper's Ferry raid while staying in Iowa. Portrait of Augustus Caesar Dodge. Julia A. Darling painted this portrait of Iowa's senior senator, Augustus Caesar Dodge, in the mid-1800s. Dodge supported the Compromise of 1850 with these words, quote, I will vote for it because I wish to get the subject, slavery, from before us. I am sick, sore, and tired of it, end quote. Ironically, his co-sponsorship of the Kansas-Nebraska Act 4 years later nullified the Compromise of 1850 and created a violent political storm. An image on the wall, the United States Senate, 1850. The Compromise of 1850 addressed the burning issue of slavery in Western lands destined to become states. This print, the United States Senate, AD 1850, is from a hand-colored engraving executed by Peter F. Rothermel and engraved by Robert Whitechurch. At center is Kentuckian Henry Clay introducing the Compromise of 1850. With him are John C. Calhoun and Daniel Webster, among others, who helped forge the agreement that averted war for another decade. Image 1 caption, Unidentified enslaved person, circa 1850, from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Image 2 caption, this Iowa newspaper notice of a freedom seeker named Lucy offers an award for her apprehension. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Several artifacts are on display. Chief Justice Charles Mason decision in the case of Ralph. In contrast to the harsh black codes passed by the Iowa Territorial Legislature, the Iowa Supreme Court in the case of Ralph set free a former Missouri enslaved person living and working in Iowa. This is the handwritten decision of Chief Justice Charles Mason. Facsimile, original from the collections of the State Historical Archives of Iowa. Black codes. Iowa's territorial laws contained black codes that restricted the settlement of blacks in Iowa and prohibited them from voting. Such black codes commonly appeared in northern states. Southerners expressed white supremacy by maintaining slavery. Northerners expressed the same attitude by keeping black people away. Field artillery. Several artifacts are on display. Small cannon. In 1857, John Brown left Kansas, and his men stayed at the Quaker settlement in Springdale, Iowa, where they planned their next move. Brown probably used this small cannon to prepare his followers at the William Maxon farm for a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. Maxon was an Underground Railroad conductor and abolitionist. Accompanying Brown from Iowa were Jeremiah Anderson of Yellow Spring, Stuart Taylor of West Liberty, and Edwin and Barclay Coppock of Springdale. Brown and his men wanted to seize the federal arsenal, supply weapons to rebelling freedom seekers, and begin overthrowing the entire system of slavery. Brown's raid failed, and he was hanged on December 2, 1859. Ammunition: U.S. 12-pound spherical shell with Borman fuse. A spherical shell is a hollow iron ball filled with explosive. The Borman fuse is a timed fuse ranging from 5 to 5.5 seconds. The fuse screws into the shell and is ignited by the explosion firing the shell. This shell came from the battle at Vicksburg. U.S. 12-pound spherical shell with wood sabot and Borman fuse. U.S. 12-pound solid shot with wood sabot. A solid cast iron ball was used against massed troops, artillery emplacements, and fortifications. U.S. 12-pound stand of grape shot. Grape shot is an anti-personnel round. It consists of 9 iron balls encased in an open container that bursts apart when fired. By the time of the Civil War, grape shot was little used, being supplanted by the canister round. U.S. 12-pound canister shot. During the Civil War, canister shot was one of the most deadly types of ammunition. It consists of a thin metal canister packed with layers of iron or lead balls. When fired, the canister broke apart, the balls fanned out, simulating a large shotgun. It was very effective against infantry. U.S. 12-pound spherical shell with wood plug, unlabeled cannonball, unlabeled cannon replica. Model 1857 12-pounder Napoleon cannon. The 12-pound smoothbore Napoleon cannon was the most popular cannon used during the war. When properly loaded with 2 1/2 pounds of black powder, it would throw a 12-pound iron ball nearly a mile, or 1,600 yards. Many Iowa batteries were equipped with this type of gun. The name Napoleon is a reference to Napoleon III of France, where the cannon was first designed. Image caption: the watercolor by Civil War artist J.E. Taylor, suspended overhead, shows a Napoleon cannon in action. Image from the State Historical Society of Iowa. Additional artifacts are on display. Wood rammer and sponge. This artillery tool consists of a double-ended pole with a block on one end and a sponge on the other. The block was used to push the cannon charge down the barrel, while the sponge was used to cleanse the barrel and to extinguish leftover sparks after firing. The primitive condition of this rammer may indicate that it was made in the field. Image 2 caption: Union artillery pieces being stored and repaired at a Virginia base. Image from the Library of Congress. Thumb stall. The thumb stall is a leather pad worn by the gunner. It was used to cover the vent hole while swabbing out the barrel and during reloading. Confederate and Union friction primers. In order to fire a cannon, it is necessary to ignite the powder in the barrel with a friction primer. This primer gets pushed down the vent hold, and a lanyard is hooked to a ring on top. The gunner pulls the lanyard, creating a spark that ignites the fulminate of mercury in the tube, which ignites the powder in the cannon. The result is a resounding kaboom. Model 1832 artillery short sword. More symbol than combat weapon, the Model 1832 short sword was based upon a French design that took its inspiration from a Roman weapon called the gladius. This sword was used mostly to clear brush and to cut trails. Tree section from the battlefield at Chickamauga, Georgia. The battlefield of Chickamauga took place on September 19th and 20th, 1863 in northwestern Georgia. The battle was the most significant defeat of Union troops in the war's western theater and involved the second highest number of casualties in the war, second only to the Battle of Gettysburg. This tree section was taken from a white oak tree that stood near Confederate General Braxton Bragg as he commanded his troops on Snodgrass Hill. The quantity of case shot and other iron shot embedded in it is a testament to the iron hail into which troops would advance. Ketchum grenade. The Ketchum grenade was patented by William Ketchum in 1861 and partially adopted by the Union Army. Although not very effective, it was used in the sieges of Vicksburg and Petersburg. The grenade has a cast iron ball or shell with a wood shaft and paper fins, missing here. To be effective, it had to land on the percussion cap plunger within its nose. In one incident, Confederates caught the grenades in blankets and threw them back at the Yankees. Small hand cannon. This small homespun Confederate cannon is made from a tuyere, which is a part of a blast furnace that pushes air into the furnace. This device, which came from Georgia, was probably not very effective.